Hello and welcome to this Bone Matters session on the emotional impact of osteoporosis. This session is really aiming to help people living with osteoporosis, with or without fractures, to feel able to manage the emotional impact of their condition. Now, there are many emotions you tell us about, including fear, anxiety, many other feelings. Not everyone's going to feel like this, but we know that some of you do. Let me start by saying that some of the feelings people tell us about are perhaps based on misunderstandings about osteoporosis. And if you feel that's you, then do remember we have a specialist nurse helpline if you want to talk more about your condition. This session is really about feelings, and we plan to offer you hopefully some practical and immediate tips and tools if you're feeling in distress right now, but also hopefully some broader strategies, really, new ways of thinking to help you cope with your feelings in the long term. Before we go on, I just want to acknowledge that you might be someone who's perhaps a carer living with someone with osteoporosis. We won't be focusing specifically on your situation, but hope there might be something here for you too. So let's move ahead. And I wanted to start by welcoming Ezra Hewing from Mind in Suffolk. And he's going to be working with me on this session. Ezra, could we perhaps start if you introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your job, your expertise?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me to join today, Sarah. My name's Ezra Hewing. I'm Head of Education at Suffolk Mind. I oversee and mentor a very busy training team and develop training for people working in a wide range of settings, both mental health settings and in businesses and charities, the third sector, and so on. My background really is as a therapist and a trainer working in young offenders institutes to begin with, and then in community mental health services. And my MSc is in the neuroscience and psychology of mental health. So I kind of straddle both the kind of the treatment end and the research end, and I'm interested in mental health and well-being in all sorts of different contexts. So very grateful to Bone Matters to having me on today.
Oh, thank you, and we're very grateful for you joining us. So I'm going to, before I hand over to you, Ezra, I'm going to just set the scene a little bit in terms of emotions and feelings and osteoporosis. Not covering everything, I'm sure, but perhaps sort of touching on some of the common themes that come through and what you tell us about. Some feelings, I think, are very much based on what might happen in the future. Often people get a diagnosis of osteoporosis. They may not have broken any bones. They may have perhaps seen relatives with severe fractures. And many of the feelings people have are based on what might happen in the future. But also, some people are experiencing feelings in terms of what's already happened. So they may have had fractures, they may be dealing with pain and symptoms, changes in shape of the body due to spinal fractures. What we hear are a huge range of fears and anxieties. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that. So I think some of the fears are very much around having a chronic disease, one that's associated with getting older, so that throws up all sorts of feelings. There's a whole lot of fear around breaking bones and what that might mean, the future, pain, disability, effects on daily living, independence, how life might change really, and relationships and so on. And really a lot of fears that what you do might cause a fracture. So people are worried about exercise and personal sexual relationships, falling over, lots of things, lots of anxiety and fear there. There are wider fears around drugs that are used to strengthen bones, side effects. So there's a big sphere of anxiety there. People worrying perhaps about lots of broader aspects like jobs, financial security, what they will or will not be able to do if they have broken bones, and effects on their personal relationships. And we do know that people who've had fractures, so particularly spinal fractures, are dealing often with the feelings thrown up by long-term pain, as I say, changes in feelings of self-esteem, body image. We know that people spine changes shape, they feel different about themselves. So a huge range of feelings around low mood, possibly feeling of hopelessness, particularly when people have had many fractures and they're not quite sure if they're going to start recovering and going back to the same quality of life that they had, and perhaps they're losing contact with friends and relatives. So a loss of control perhaps over what's happening to their bodies and ultimately the future. So sorry, that sounds like a huge range of negativity there, and not everybody's going to be feeling like that, but I hope that's perhaps set the scene in terms of the sorts of feelings that we hear about, that we wanted to sort of touch on today and help you with. Okay, so that's the context. I'm going to kind of throw over to you now, Ezra, and we're going to talk through perhaps some of the strategies that may help people. And obviously your experience is much wider than osteoporosis, but I'm sure there are commonalities here in terms of the sorts of feelings that people are dealing with that can be extended across many situations. So what we've decided we're going to do is I'm going to I've got some common questions here, and I'm going to kind of set them out to you, and I think you're going to have a go at coming up with some ideas and information.
Sure. I'll try. Okay? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is one that certainly I've heard this one recently, and I think it's a useful one. Someone who says, I am suddenly housebound. So this is someone who's had a major fracture, probably a hip fracture, and I really don't know whether I'm ever going to get better. That's the feeling, feeling overwhelmed with emotions, so feeling very, very low. Anything you can offer here?
Yes, I think with, I'll come back to a really key idea throughout our conversation, Sarah, and that's the idea that all mental health and well-being really depends upon us meeting a number of emotional needs. Now, we're all familiar with physical needs for things like food and drink, for sleep, and to be physically active. But we have emotional needs too, which include things like feeling safe, feeling that we have some control over the course of our lives. Social needs like community, sharing attention, emotional connection, feeling that we're able to achieve things in our lives and that we're competent and that we're able to take part in activities which give us a sense that life has meaning and purpose to it. Now, the thing about any major life change, whether it's perhaps a change in our occupation, perhaps a changing job, as people have been unemployed for a time, it could be a new addition to the family if you've got children or something of that nature. We've all been through recent events where there were major life changes that affected our ability to be able to meet needs in the way that we were accustomed to meeting them. So we'd have been less able to connect with people during lockdown and so on and so forth. Maybe we weren't working, or we were furloughed, or our business was on hold, or whatever it was. But those sorts of environmental changes affect the way that we meet those sorts of needs. And that's very daunting, can certainly be overwhelming. If somebody is in a situation where they are housebound and they can't go out, what that means is that they'll be unable to meet needs in the way that they have done in the past. And a kind of, once we acknowledge that, a first baby step, if you like, is to identify which needs are not being met, and then begin to perhaps ask others for help in thinking about it if you're finding it challenging yourself. Could be that you contact an agency like a charity like Suffolk Mind, but you want to begin to identify new ways in which you can meet needs. So if our needs for community and emotional connection, sharing attention, if those needs are poorly met because we're housebound, it might be that we need to find other ways of being able to connect with people. And that could be that we're joining groups online, and there could be groups that are focused on learning how to cope and manage osteoporosis, but not necessarily. They could be groups which have a different focus, that are focused on a particular activity, a reading group or something of that nature, where you've got something in common with other people and you're beginning to build relationships and beginning to connect with the outside world. If you've always being the kind of person that finds it easy to go out and connect up with other people. Perhaps you go out for a coffee a few times a week, or maybe you were the person that was organizing other people getting together. Then finding new ways and asking people for help with finding new ways of connecting with other people. I'd suggest that that's a really important first step. And as you begin to get those needs met, then you can find other ways of addressing other needs. So it might be social needs to begin with, then it might be something to do with meaning and purpose, or finding new hobbies that you're no longer able to do, things which are achievable and that can give you something to focus your attention on, and perhaps you can begin to learn and develop skills that kind of build your self-esteem and confidence again. The loss of control and autonomy is a huge one with any physical condition, which we don't know whether recovery is possible. We don't know whether we're going to be able to manage it. It can feel like it's out of our hands. And a useful exercise for addressing unmet needs for autonomy is an exercise which some of our viewers may have come across before. Is called the circles of influence. And circles of influence involves you can draw circles, or you can make 3 lists. And in your first list are the things that you cannot control at all, that none of us can really. So they're things like the weather, natural disasters, election outcomes, that kind of a thing. Although you could argue that you might have some influence there, I suppose. And that's your second list. Your second list is things you don't control, but which you do have some influence over. And then finally, and this is the most important circle of all, it's a list of things which you can control. And that could be things like, what you choose to watch on television, whether you choose to read a particular hobby or an interest. If you're able to cook for yourself, what you like to cook, when you eat, that kind of a thing. And really learning to give attention to what you can control so that you can take it away from the things that you can't control. And that can meet your need for control and autonomy and empower people, and also begin to expand our kind of creative thinking around coping strategies and coming up with new ways of meeting needs that we might never have considered before, because often we take things for granted until we're faced with a life-changing event.
Thank you. So really some new strategies there. And also at the beginning, I think you talked about not being afraid to sort of reach out and make new contacts and new people that you might be able to connect with. So there's some really useful strategies there, I think.
Absolutely. And as a we'll come back to this idea throughout our conversation, but that's the kind of the bedrock, if you like, a life that works to meet needs, which I, recognize is hugely daunting and challenging if we've been accustomed to, kind of going about our lives, and then this comes along, and we've got to kind of reevaluate and perhaps start from scratch in many instances.
Thank you. My second question really is dealing with the emotional aspects of living with a long-term health condition, because this is what we're talking about here. Perhaps the new normal is what we're thinking about. Any other ideas there?
Yes, well, it is a new normal, and again, it kind of takes us back to this key idea about needing to find new ways to meet emotional needs, and we should also acknowledge that there may be, for some people, a difficulty with letting go of things that they used to be able to do, and give yourself some time with that as well. Adjustment doesn't happen overnight. If you've been used to, I don't know, taking part in a park run, or you had friends at a gym, or even if you weren't that physically active, but there was a lot that you could take for granted, like you could push a buggy, or you could go to the park with children or grandchildren or whatever it is. There's a lot to adjust to there, and it's going to require sort of some time to find new ways of being able to connect with people and take part in those sorts of activities in a way which you feel safe with, I think.
Yes, and I think sometimes with osteoporosis, with fractures, it is in the here and now. So sometimes actually you feel like you're never going to get back to normal, and indeed you may. But on the other hand, as you're saying, it is recognizing, isn't it, that there may be things that you may not be able to do again, and it's finding new ways of
yes,
new ways of doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my next question was this fear about breaking bones, and
Mm.
sometimes it's a real fear and sometimes it isn't. It's because it may never happen, but there are strong feelings coming out here of emotions around anxiety and so on. How do people cope perhaps even in the here and now if they're feeling very, very anxious?
Yes. Okay. I'll sort of talk you through a few steps, but I'd like to share a technique with you as well, which I think the viewers will find helpful. Well, I hope they will anyway. But I think the first thing to really understand is what the purpose of fear and anxiety are. So I think, as you said, Sarah, anxiety is about concern about the future, whereas fear can be very much kind of a thing that feels very much like it's in the moment. And that's right, because those emotions serve the purpose of trying to keep us safe, fear in the present, and anxiety trying to keep us safe by avoiding things that might cause us pain or discomfort in the future. So there's a sense in which they're actually really helpful and useful. If you didn't have fear or anxiety, or if our ancestors hadn't, it's likely that we wouldn't be here now. And there's a particular part of our brain that is concerned with keeping us safe. Now, the kind of the neuroscience term for this part of the brain, or the two particular parts of the brain, is the amygdala, which is a Greek word which means almond. And if you wanted to give somebody a kind of a simple kind of explanation of where their amygdalas might be located, then one way of thinking about it is like this. It's a very simple hand model of the brain where if you imagine that my thumbs are my amygdalas, and I sort of tuck them into the palms of my hands and then just wrap my fingers over the top, and you imagine those are the two halves of the brain, and the fingers over the top, that's the kind of the part of the brain that allows us to manage strong emotions and to try and think a bit more clearly and rationally, really. But our thumbs are much stronger, and if they decide that there's a threat, real or imagined, then they can fire off strong emotion and override our ability to think clearly. Now, most people in the UK probably don't speak Greek or Latin as their first language, so we don't call it the amygdala at Suffolk Mind. Instead, we refer to it as the security officer or the security officers. And they're there to really try and keep us safe. So the first thing to acknowledge is that if you are feeling fear or anxiety, it's part of your brain trying to keep you safe. It's just doing its job. But you also have lots of other resources as well. So we have an ability to calm ourselves down, which a lot of us are not necessarily very practiced at, but you can do it nonetheless. And we also have an ability, when we're feeling a bit calmer, to think more clearly and to identify things which are realistic risks and which are not. I think it's also important to acknowledge that our security officers may have learned from previous fractures or injuries what it feels like, and be, naturally concerned and hypervigilant and looking out for things to go wrong. And while that can seem that is a natural response and can be helpful, it can also, if we're stressed, it can leave us more vulnerable to sudden movements, less in control of how we move, and perhaps more at risk in a sense. So the one thing that we can do, which is incredibly powerful for lots of people to begin to calm the security officers down, involves our breathing. When we're feeling anxious or we're feeling fearful, what will tend to happen is that the pattern of our breathing will change. And in particular, the out breath will get shorter. And that's because the body wants to get to the next in breath. It wants to get oxygen into the system to power the muscles to run away from whatever the perceived threat is. And that's what viewers may have heard referred to as a fight or flight response. But luckily, there's always a balance in nature. So there's something which counterbalances the fight or flight response. And that's often referred to as the relax and digest response. And the way that you activate that is by adopting a different breathing pattern. So instead of short out breaths, you adopt long out breaths instead. And if you're sitting watching this at the moment, if you like, what I'll do is I'll just take you through that just for a couple of minutes. And if you imagine that my hand over here, if you can see that, is on a balloon that's inflating and deflating. And just to begin with, we're going to breathe in 2, 3, 4, 5. Then out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we're going to breathe in through our tummy as well, which is which allows us basically to avoid shallow breathing, but also means that we can get a bit more control over it and put less pressure on our lungs and what have you, which is good if you if you have difficulties with breathing for whatever reason, whether it's COPD or asthma. Many people suffer with those sorts of problems. So you're going to fill your tummy and your lungs up with air, breathing in 2, 3, 4, 5, and then out more slowly 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. A bit longer this time. In 2, 3, 4, 5. And then out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then you can just close your eyes for a moment and just breathe in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then breathe in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then out longer 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now, the numbers in a sense don't really matter. The key point is that the out breath just needs to become longer. Perhaps if you can find somewhere comfortable to sit down or lay down for a time. I often suggest taking a warm bath to relax, but don't do this breathing exercise in the bath for too long, because some people might fall asleep, and that's not such a good idea if you're in the bath for obvious reasons. But if you can perhaps imagine yourself or find somewhere where you feel calm and relaxed, and perhaps just for 10 minutes a day, just spend some time practicing that skill. And the benefits of that is that it will help us to feel generally more relaxed and therefore less kind of hyper vigilant and at risk of making sudden movements. And it will also mean that if you have times where something suddenly happens and you need to be able to calm things down quite quickly, then you'll be quite practiced at that technique, and you'll remember just to slow the out breath down, breathing in and out through your stomach. So that's one particular skill that you can kind of like practice and add to your toolkit to help you manage fear and anxiety.
Thank you, Ezra. I had my eyes closed and was nearly asleep myself, so thank you. And actually, interestingly, people with multiple spinal fractures do often feel very like the breathing is a problem because everything's sort of scrunched up inside. So I think that's a useful tip from other aspects as well. Breathing's quite, it is something people talk about. So thank you for that.
Breathing, absolutely. Breathing through our tummy is more. I mean, we tend to shallow breathe, as I said, but if we're sort of shallow breathing, then really our rib cage is more involved, and if people do have skeletal issues, then that's not quite so helpful. Breathing through your tummy might be more gentler and more achievable.
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's good to have a practical tip as well, because I think some of these strategies, as we say, are sort of the long term, but it's really useful to have something in the here and now, because there may be people listening who are feeling distressed right now. Yeah. Thank you. So the next question, and you already touched on this a bit, is about quite understandably how people sometimes catastrophize about the future, because you hear you've got osteoporosis, you see people with dreadful fractures. That might never be you, but that's how it feels it's going to be. How can people manage these negative thoughts and this real uncertainty about the future?
It's a really great question. So the thing to remember about negative thoughts is that they tend to be stronger when we're in a heightened state of emotional arousal. So the first step is always to do something, learn some skills that can begin to calm strong emotions down, like the breathing exercise that we just went through. That's the first step. And then the next thing to do is to recognize that negative thoughts are coming from a very black and white place. They're useful for risk assessment, but they're not giving us a realistic take. And we call it the 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps are pervasive thinking, permanent thinking, and personalized thinking. So pervasive thinking is where one thing happens and we think everything else has gone wrong, everything else is affected by it. And one way to challenge negative thinking and pervasive thinking is to write down examples of pervasive thoughts. So a pervasive thought, starting with a gentler one and then working up. A gentle kind of pervasive thought might be something like, I always lose my keys. It's always the case that I lose my keys. And then you might think, well, actually, I'm gonna reflect on that. Is that actually true? okay, right, I lose my keys maybe once a month. Okay, so we don't always lose our keys. It's about once a month. And then you might say, actually, do I lose my keys or do I temporarily misplace them? Okay, I did lose my keys once about 10 years ago, but in general, I'm misplacing them. And have I ever been late for anything important? And maybe, but probably not. So that's one way in which we can kind of unpack and break down a particular kind of negative thinking. The second of the three P's is permanent thinking. So that's the idea that things are always going to be bad, things are always going to be a certain way. And there may be a grain of truth in that. It could be that, I'm always going to be in a situation where I have to be careful and I'm going to, be managing osteoporosis. But then you might think, well, are there particular times where it's more of a concern, it's more of a risk? Like when I'm sitting in an armchair, am I then as much at risk of having a fracture as I would be if, for example, I was going on a walk along a difficult path in the mountains or something like that. And so you can begin to reclaim the kind of the gray areas and the nuances which get lost whenever we're in the grip of kind of black and white, strong emotion and negative thinking. So you can begin to develop the skill of seeing past permanent thinking and identifying times where it's not actually true. And that might even give you some pointers as towards the sorts of things that you might like to spend your time doing to better meet the emotional needs that we spoke about earlier on. And then the next of the three P's is personalized thinking, and that tends to come from a situation where our attention is very much focused on ourselves and feeling bad about our situation, which is quite natural. But it can also prevent us from giving attention to other people and can even cause us to talk to ourselves in ways which are quite negative and unkind. One strategy that I've used with people who are stuck in the habit of negative thinking, and sometimes that can be quite high performing people as well, who perhaps have a streak of perfectionism and they have high expectations of themselves, and they can be quite unfair and harsh on themselves. I will ask them to have a think about somebody or something that they speak to in a gentler tone. So for some people, that could be their pet. Would you talk to your pet dog or your pet cat in that way? And that's unusual. People are often very kind to their pets, and they adopt a very gentle tone, particularly in this country. And so I might ask them to have a go if they hear themselves talking in a negative way, to rephrase it as if they were talking to their pet, and adopt that the kind of the gentler parts of our nature, and then people often notice that they're being much kinder and softer with themselves. That can help them to feel a bit calmer and again more in control of looking after themselves. So those are the first step towards that really is to identify the negative thoughts. Again, maybe writing them down in a journal or a notebook or storing them on a phone or whatever medium is easiest. Then when you're feeling calmer and more relaxed, taking some time to challenge the negative thoughts and ask, are they really true, or are they giving me a distorted take on reality? And then perhaps finding a different way of reframing them or phrasing them back to yourself in a way that's gentler, softer, kinder, and probably more useful as well as a result. So that's the kind of exercise I would take somebody through if I was working with them in a therapeutic setting. And I hope that your viewers can experiment with that and that they'll find that useful too.
Thank you. So a focus on the positive there and some practical tips, which I think will be really helpful. Thank you. Moving on a bit, perhaps, to the longer term strategies again. One of the very difficult areas for people who've got multiple spinal fractures are the changes to body shape, which unfortunately are often permanent and very much loss of height, curvature of the spine, and really people feel very different about themselves. They may even feel shame and just really a lack of self-esteem over what's happening. Anything you can offer there in terms of helping people with those sorts of feelings?
Another really powerful resource, it's sometimes referred to as the observing self, which is a bit of a kind of a mental health jargon term. So the shorthand really is, it just means awareness. And one particular exercise that people might find useful is sometimes called peeling the onion. And what it means is asking yourself a series of questions that kind of help you get back into a state where you're just aware of things and observing things at one remove. So you might start by asking questions, as you've said, Sarah, about your body and how you feel about your body. So one question might be something like, if, heaven forbid, I lost one of my limbs in an accident, would I cease to exist? The answer has to be no. You still exist. However I'm feeling right now, if those feelings passed, do they come and go, or are they permanent? And the question has to be, well, they come and go. They're seldom permanent, even though we can feel like we're in the grip of depression a lot of the time. Actually, depression lifts from time to time. If we're asleep, or if we're something suddenly makes us laugh, then it can break through the trance of really strong emotions like depression and anxiety. Going back to our onion, if we ask ourselves the question, are these feelings permanent, or do they come and they go? The answer has to be that they come and they go. They're not permanent, and that's because there's an eye that's watching them from one remove. And if we're experiencing negative thoughts, are they permanent, or are they temporary? Well, they come and they go too. But when you work your way back, what does have a more of a sense of permanence is the eye, the kind of the unique eye sense of awareness, which is at the center of all of those things and is distinct from our bodily feelings and our thoughts and our emotions too. And when we're able to identify with that particular part of ourselves, we're able to see that, first of all, we're separate from our body. And then you might begin to ask yourself the question, well, who am I really? And one way of answering that question, it's not the only way, one way of answering that question is that we're all a set of experiences of knowledge and skills and relationships. And those are the things which really make up our core identity. And it's also knowledge and skills, which is where genuine, healthy self-esteem comes from. Low self-esteem can be devastating and is often rooted in traumatic or unpleasant experiences. But excessive high self-esteem is equally unhealthy as well, which is when people think too highly of themselves. And the antidote to both of those really is learning knowledge and skills, stretching ourselves to develop competencies. And they don't have to be big things. They can be things like gardening or crocheting or cooking a meal or whatever it is. Now, it could be that concerns about fracturing ourselves, if we're managing osteoporosis, are a barrier to being able to do the things which used to be a source of self-esteem for us, a source of competence. So we might need to begin the journey again of learning skills, or learning what we can do, what's realistic and not so much. But equally, we might learn entirely new skills. We might develop a passion for reading, which can take us elsewhere for a time. We might become particularly knowledgeable about a particular field that we've given lots of attention to and spend time learning and reflecting upon. And while our body is part of our identity, those other things, the knowledge and skills that nobody can take away from you, that will always be with you, that's much closer to the core of our true identity. So I would suggest perhaps doing the layers of the onion experiment to begin with, to kind of really get in touch with your sense of awareness, and then beginning to notice what you really know about what your skills and your experiences and your relationships are, the things that really shape who we are as distinct from changes in our body. If you are traumatized from previous experiences which are giving rise to feelings of shame in the present, I'd also really recommend finding a competent therapist that's good at treating trauma in a safe and non-distressing way as well. And perhaps a little bit later on we can talk about resources that people might draw upon, and include links to resources that people can access if they feel that they need to do that.
Thank you. Lots of quite new stuff there for me too, and hopefully for our audience. So thank you. Thank you. And I think, as you have said, that might be reaching out, which isn't always easy, particularly if people are stuck at home following a fracture. But I mean, I guess the fact that you're watching this and you are online, there are resources out there, and hopefully we can point you to some further resources alongside this film. So that's great. I think we've covered an awful lot there. Well, you have, Ezra, and it's been really interesting, and both in the here and now. Great to have some immediate strategies, but some broader ones too. So thank you. Before we finish, I just wanted to acknowledge that you may be watching this feeling pretty desperate right now. We've been talking about ways of thinking, planning, and broader strategies, but if you are feeling really like you need help this minute, I just wondered if you could cover that, Ezra, because we can't deal with that, the here and now that's very desperate. So you may need to reach out for other help. Do you want to make just a quick comment, Ezra, and we will provide some phone numbers alongside?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely make an appointment with your GP, not to and say that it's an emergency, and they should be able to put you in contact with social prescribers and people that can address the things more holistically, if you like. If you are in need of support right now, then we'll include the number for the Samaritans at the bottom. Find your local Mind association as well, and you can either find that through National Minds directory, or if you're in your local area, then search for Mind and the name of your local area, and you'll find a local Mind association now local Mind associations offer different services, but very often there will be telephone support services, or at least somebody on the end of a reception number who can put you in contact with support groups and people that can make contact with you and begin to help you in the here and now, and perhaps help to reduce distress and kind of calm things down a little bit.
Thank you. That's great, Ezra. And I think a very good point to end on is about seeking more help if you need it. So thank you so much, Ezra, for giving your time and your expertise. And thank you all for listening. I do hope you found something here to help and support you. And as I say, more resources alongside this film if you need them. So thank you and goodbye.
My name is Niki, and I'm one of the specialist nurses who works on the helpline at the Royal Osteoporosis Society. We frequently hear of anxieties and fears that many people do have with a diagnosis of osteoporosis and following fractures, and especially spinal fractures. I'm joined by Laura Wolfson, who has osteoporosis and has had fractures and has experienced these fears and worries firsthand. Laura and I are going to explore some of these feelings that she experienced and how she coped with them at the time. Well, welcome, Laura. We're very grateful you can help us with this session. To get us going, can I start by asking you to give a brief overview of your diagnosis with osteoporosis and the fractures that you've had?
Well, I was actually diagnosed with osteopenia when I was in my early 30s. I'd been cycling home from work and I broke my wrist, and I went to the doctor and they looked at the x-ray of my hand and said it looked thin and I should see a doctor. And so when I got a phone call by an endocrinologist saying, "We've been looking for you, you need to come and see us," I was very shocked. And then he said to me, well, if you don't do anything about this, you'll be in a wheelchair when you're 70. And that was very shocking and frightening. And I felt very lonely at the time, especially because I was in my early 30s and there weren't very many other people with osteoporosis I could talk to. But I did actually at that point join the Royal Osteoporosis Society, and it was really helpful to get information then. And then, you know, life happened and osteoporosis went on the back burner. I took medication. And then, of course, when I hit the menopause is when I had my spinal fracture. And, you know, and then again, I saw a doctor and they said, "Oh, it's gotten a lot worse." And that was also very frightening and shocking. But I think by that time, I'd had enough other bad things happen to me in my life, so it was a bit easier to cope with.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. In his film, Ezra talked about, when we talk about emotional impact of a diagnosis, we're also talking about emotional well-being, and that we all have emotional needs that need to be met. Do you kind of, looking at these kind of emotional needs, do you think that kind of resonates with you? Do you, even though it may not have been the way you were thinking at the time, can you look back and see that had something to do with it?
Absolutely. I mean, and also particularly but when I was diagnosed with a spinal fracture, because by that time I was a widow with teenage children. And so as a single parent, when you don't want to worry your children, and you know that, you know, my children's dad had died when they were 6 and 9. So I really didn't want to talk about my diagnosis or really share that, and it become an extra worry. So that was a great feeling of loneliness and loss of control. And I had to think very carefully about how I was going to deal with that, what I was going to be able to do and what not. And in the end, almost kind of think, right, well, then there just are going to be some things I can't do, and the house is just going to be a bit more messy.
Right, okay. Well, that's really interesting, because we're going to come on to what we consider we can control and what we can't control. And Ezra has things to say about this in his video. He says that it's often useful to kind of look at our emotional needs and which ones are not being met. And sometimes it can feel as though we've lost control of an awful lot. But letting go of what we can no longer do is difficult to do. We want to hang on and we want things to remain the same. So Ezra talks about identifying, acknowledging that some things are not going to go back to that. And it's helpful to let it go, but also to acknowledge that it's not easy and that it doesn't happen overnight. It's not something you can just make a decision and it's sorted, it's done. No. It's a gradual change. And sometimes you do better, then sometimes you slip back. So it's a gradual way of letting go. But you need to do that to allow new ways of doing things to introduce themselves.
The idea of letting go is very linked to aging, because we all, you know, age and we think we're not aging, and then suddenly we realize we can't do something and we've aged. We can't stand on one leg anymore, or we can't, you know, do a plank in the Pilates class. And I think osteoporosis is just, or a fracture is just a sort of more pronounced version of that. Kind of, you come up against reality thinking, oh gosh, you know, this is really not going to work. And I think I always go back to my husband's advice. He was an NHS psychiatrist, and he said to me once that the most difficult thing for people is something called the loss of a cherished idea. And that's what you're talking about in terms of the future we thought we had. But in a sense, we never had that, because it was just an idea. And if we can kind of come back to ourselves and to where we are right now, you don't have to kind of pound yourself and think I must let go. You can just try and stay with yourself where you are now and take it from there, which is a sort of gentler way.
Yes, let it gradually happen. Ezra talked a number of ways of trying to work our way through difficult times, and he gave this explanation about how our brain is hardwired to keep us safe, and it does that by making us avoid certain things that we feel might be dangerous. And I know you've talked about avoidance and in your previous films and as well, and it says, you know, the brain is just doing the job. But sometimes if fear becomes overwhelming, it almost goes into panic mode, and it can no longer think clearly to get you out of a dangerous situation. And what you really need is your brain to be working this out. Right, I've got a problem here. Well, how am I going to deal with this? Because when you're overwhelmed by feelings, it just blocks all that out again. So one of his techniques was really about calming your thoughts. How do you do that when you just feel your thoughts are overwhelmed? And he talked about a breathing technique, because when we've all experienced this, when we're stressed, you may notice we start to breathe much more shallowly. I don't know if you've ever used a breathing technique, Laura.
You know, I'm a chronically anxious person, and I've found in much of my life, anxiety has been a real problem, and it's done exactly what you described, feeling very overwhelmed, panicky. So I find it very difficult to get myself to that point of thinking I'm now going to do this breathing exercise. But what I did discover, I joined a local Pilates group of people round about my age. And I was very lucky because our Pilates teacher used to work in an NHS falls unit for older people who were falling. And what we do in this Pilates class is we also practice breathing, slow breathing and balance exercises. And because I'm in a group, there's 5 of us, I just find that easier. I find it much easier when I'm in a group and I can do this exercise together, because I just feel supported by the group in a way that I don't on my own. So that's my way of tackling that, really.
That's really interesting. One of the last things that Ezra talked about as well was another strategy was to peel the onion, which I hadn't heard before. And he was saying it's another way of trying to stop everything as being the worst case ever, a kind of catastrophe. And so apart from sort of finding out that these thoughts are not permanent, he also felt that it's often a good idea to sort of just not see yourself as those negative thoughts, that there is the real you behind it. You haven't changed. And then he went on to being kinder to ourselves. That often we develop negative thoughts and we don't like our bodies, we don't like what's happening, and we're critical of ourselves. Again, I don't know if that sort of is something that you've come across, or is a new thought for you.
I mean, very much so. But I think a really important thing to me is the anger. I think having a diagnosis like osteoporosis, or fearing a painful many years and an unpleasant death, it makes you angry, and it's very difficult to step back and do these things that you just described if you're feeling angry or really angry. And at the same time, the anger is part of working through a difficult piece of news like this diagnosis. But I think one good thing about most people who have osteoporosis are diagnosed slightly later in life, and they will have had other experiences which have made them angry and feel out of control. And yet they still continued, because life just does. And, I mean, I don't feel like the same person. I feel like a different person, just like I felt different after I'd had a baby. I didn't feel like the same person, but I still feel I am a person, and I am me. I'm just someone who's gone through these different experiences. Some have been lovely, like having a child, and some of them have been difficult, like losing a husband or getting a rubbish health diagnosis. And so I think, yes, I think it's great if you can sort of try and give yourself a bit more space and look and try and observe yourself and be kinder. But I think that's almost only possible if you allow yourself to go through the feelings that the diagnosis evokes in you. In other words, feel the anger. As cliche as that sounds, but it is something. I don't think it is actually helpful. It sounds counterintuitive, but it is helpful, because then you do realize at the end, we are still we, and we go on.
Yes, that's so interesting. So you kind of touched on all of that, really, but ultimately we will change throughout our life, and it's about sort of managing as best we can and changing things, that we are still leading a life that's important to us and is meaningful to us, but also still being kind to ourselves and accepting this is life, and not beating ourselves up about it, because it's wasted energy. You've got enough to deal with. It's just being kind to yourself and allowing it to happen, but looking at ways to make life better where you can. But to do that, you need to calm your thoughts down first.
Yes, and also realizing, I think often when one feels angry like that and resentful, and that, why me? Why does this happen to me? But it happens to lots of people. Lots of people have really bad things happening to them, not just us. And I think that's sometimes, good to remind yourself. There's people, you go and you walk out in your street and you think of all the people and all the different tablets all these people are taking, and whether they might have a cancer diagnosis or all the things, but they all live with it. And I think one can kind of gain strength from thinking, it's not just me, it's lots of people.
Lord, that is so useful, so useful. This seems like a really good point to finish on. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to you, Laura, for really supporting us with these films. Your experience is really invaluable for us, and to also let us hear some of the really difficult times you've been through. I know it's not easy to talk about them sometimes for many of us. And I'd like to also thank you, our listeners, and I hope you found that there's something in the film that you feel can help you. Thank you again for watching.